so no doubt we'll hear a lot more about the sad and troubling case of Oscar Pistorius and the death by shooting of his girlfriend Rave Steenkamp on Valentine's Day, for a final touch of the ironic macabre. Now, the ingredients are obvious. The disabled athlete, fresh from his London Olympic fairy tale, the beautiful victim, the savage violence of her end. It's made for media. It'll run and run. But putting that and the court proceedings aside, my next guest says that ultimately this is a very South African story. This is a nation where apartheid, he argues, normalised violence, where gun culture and misogynistic attacks are rife. He wrote his thoughts down this week for the New York Times in a piece headed "Cry the Misogynistic Country." His name is Eusebius McKaiser. He's a political analyst, a broadcaster based in Johannesburg. He joins you now. Good morning, Eusebius. Welcome to Sunday Extra.
Good morning, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, let's expand on that idea that this is a very South African story. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, let me say that the starting point for that observation, Jonathan, is that most people would be inclined to think that it's a highly unique, highly personalized story. Both his success is a disabled athlete who eventually competed with able-bodied athletes, and also that the circumstances of the alleged crime are highly unique, where he, on his version, mistook her for an intruder, and on the state's version, it was a domestic fight that had gone wrong. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, Jonathan, that it's a very South African story, because on either version of what happened, it's a typical South African story. If indeed he thought it was an intruder, despite the fact that he lives in a high security cluster environment, then it's a typical South African story in the sense that what happened was an accident born out of profound paranoia about safety, and that is the South African story that is typical. On the other hand, if the state proves its case beyond reasonable doubt, and it really was domestic violence gone horribly wrong, that too is typically South African, because South Africa is a country where women and girls get raped and murdered every 4 minutes, and ultimately the fact that he is wealthy, the fact that he is white, does not preclude him from the same kind of violence you might find in a black, poor township. So on any of the versions that are before the court at the moment, there are some very South African themes.
Now, that sense, and on the first of those explanations, perhaps we might take them one at a time, but the sense of paranoia, that fear of violence, was that what gave this story initial extraordinary resonance throughout South Africa?
No, what gave it initial resonance throughout South Africa is that it sounded like the worst possible romantic tragedy gone wrong, because it was the morning of Valentine's Day, and here is this incredible international sporting hero. His life is similar to the life of the country, a miracle that had happened where an underdog had managed to become a champion in the world, sort of similar to the country's own history as we emerge from the ashes of apartheid. So the first reaction was just, oh gosh, this is the ultimate Shakespearean tragedy. But as the days went by and the possibility of premeditated murder became real, and the possibility of domestic violence became real, then it was clear that this wasn't some sort of romantic fairy tale gone wrong on Valentine's Day, but rather a familiar South African tale, either about domestic violence or alternatively about the paranoia of living in a country with so much crime that you might mistake a loved one as an intruder.
Do you take that back there, this sort of the violence of the country, back to the apartheid era? Explain that to me.
Yeah, look, it's very complicated, Jonathan, in the sense that we have agency as individuals. You know, if you go about killing someone and it's proven that you killed someone, premeditated murder being the motivation, then of course one can't blame apartheid. The fact that apartheid happened does not preclude you from having your own autonomy to make choices in life. So what I did not intend to do with my New York Times piece is to excuse South African violence by saying we're all automatons and we don't have an ability
I can sense that sort of national scar tissue, if you like. I wonder, Silvius Mikasa, I mean, this has been a huge story around the world. I can only imagine how much this has dominated the media within South Africa. I'm wondering if at this point, a week or so down the track, whether that sort of introspection, that sort of national introspection of which you speak there, is becoming part of the narrative around this killing.
Absolutely it is, and it started about 2 weeks before this killing, Jonathan, when a 17-year-old poor black South African girl, Anine Boyson, was raped, disemboweled, and left to die by a bunch of young people who had attacked her in a small, poor town on the South Cape coast. That was our Indian moment. It was the equivalent of the shock that we've seen in India in light of the rape that happened there. So just before this particular incident involving Oscar Pistorius, the country already had momentum for about 2 weeks doing soul searching around violence against women and violence in general. So the country at the moment is caught up in the particular detail around Oscar Pistorius, which is a highly unique story in the sense of the disabled athlete who's done amazing things and now might be a fallen hero. But at the same time, the national discourse in South Africa is swiftly moving towards asking, what does the story say about us as a country? What are we going to do about our gratuitous acts of violence? And we dare no longer be quiet, complicit, and normalizing and internalizing the levels of violence as we have over the last couple of years.
It's something, I guess, Silvius Mikasa, that some sort of positivity can come from events that are so grim and so tragic. Thank you for your time this morning.
It's a pleasure.
Silvius Mikasa is a political analyst in Johannesburg, a broadcaster there too, a former Rhodes Scholar.
Okay, YouTube. Let's us just continue with the features of the Oscar Pistorius case, which did not appear in that Sunday morning radio coverage. We have a situation where a bloke who'd become known as Crybaby Blade Runner, because when he went to the Paralympics in London, he burst into a series of complaints that somebody else who had fiberglass lower legs and was running faster times than Oscar Pistorius was running, the other fella must obviously be cheating and must obviously have his leg lengths artificially extrapolated too far. So we got to see a bloke who'd been hitherto touted as a brilliant citizen individual sportsman because he could run fast on fiberglass legs. This is an obvious extension of the theory that anybody who's good at any form of sporting endeavour is therefore a model citizen. Seems a bit of a long jump to me that anybody who's self-obsessed, self-motivated, self-oriented, to the point where they want to prove that they are the best in the world at something that's functionally useless, like how fast can you run 100 metres? I mean, there's not many people who chase rabbits and catch them for a living. So being able to run 100 metres is not actually a useful skill in contemporary society. Being able to kick a ball or hit it with a stick, equally useless as a skill. Being the best in the world at playing tennis, it only has value because other people who like to watch tennis want to pay to watch it happen. It's a life of exquisite narcissistic extrapolation and focusing on oneself. And bear in mind, I get a pension for narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial traits, so I know a little bit about narcissism. I know a bit about being a control freak with overcompensated inferiority complexes and the great difficulty in perceiving anybody else with a different opinion as having a legitimate right to that opinion. There's a whole well-beaten track for narcissists to go on where anybody who disagrees with them is not only in error, which they may or may not be, but it's assumed by the narcissist that anybody who disagrees is automatically in error. But because they're in error and they persist in their perceived error, then therefore they are wicked and evil, and they're personal enemies of the affronted narcissist, and that they need to be put down and disposed of. So this style of a narcissist doesn't deal well with failing to accelerate up the curve, and it seems that crybaby Pistorius hit his peak when he went to the able-bodied Olympics and ran faster than a person who had natural-born legs. Oscar Pistorius didn't have legs because his were cut off because he didn't have any fibulas, I think. I don't know whether it was he had missing tibias as well, but yeah, he was congenitally malformed, and they cut his legs off because they reckon he'd be better off on artificial stumps or artificial legs strapped to his stumps. And on carbon fibre blades, he can run faster than the best athlete on the planet with normal, natural legs. So he achieved big things. I still don't understand why being able to run fast or kick a ball fast or do anything in any kind of sporting endeavour is considered to be automatically indicative of being a good citizen. Perhaps, this is a faint hypothesis of mine, because you can't get into the military unless you participate in team sport, then therefore, because the military gets lionised for standing between social constructs and the worldview and all the perceived threats in the outside world, there's some supposed connection, particularly in the propaganda mills of the people who run the military and the commercial end of sport, that because the military makes heroes and you have to be prepared to play sport to be in the military, then therefore being good at sport means that you're a sporting hero and thus a potential military hero, and therefore thus and because an exemplary citizen who can give orders, take orders, die in a ditch, do what they're told, salute the flag, shoot at a stranger you've never seen because a politician you maybe not vote for tells you that it's necessary for your national honour for you to go and die in a ditch trying to shoot at the stranger. So perhaps that's the chain of pseudo-logic and reasoning that causes people to think that being good at sport means you're a good citizen. I think it sort of guarantees that if you're bloody-minded, pig-headed and stubborn enough to get to be the world champion, you just can't bear being nudged off the spot. Everything they had to say about South Afrika being a violent, misogynistic gun culture, yeah, sounds probably true. I think there's 2.5 million of them have got guns for self-defence. And self-defence is the idea that your personal heartbeat matters more than anybody else and what the hell they thought they were doing. And if you're in fear that somebody else is going to come up and take away your material possessions or your bag of money or your car or whatever, or even choke you to death, then you are entitled, based on that fear. You don't have to wait for them to actually do anything, you can just shoot them down because you're afraid. That's what the self-defence gun is all about. As soon as you start getting into self-defence gunfire, you discover that the best defence is a vigorous offence, and that means preemptive strikes and get your first shot in. And don't miss. So on the one hand, we have a policeman's story that he's going to charge Oscar Pistorius with deliberate murder because the police were called to the apartment, the same apartment they'd been called out to domestic violence incidents 6 times in the past 3 months. And this time the neighbours have called the police because they've heard screaming and shouting in the middle of the night. Then they've heard a couple of gunshots, they've heard some more screaming and shouting, they've heard more gunshots, and then they've heard silence, and now, you know, the ambulance is turning up. And before the fella had been charged, the story was out that, he must have mistaken his girlfriend for a burglar and shot her by mistake, you know, because it's South Africa and it's a violent place and there's lots of crime, and therefore he has a legal gun, and he perfectly honestly mistook his girlfriend for a burglar. The policeman running the case said, well, look, you know, no signs of a forced entry. There's a 10-foot wall with an electric fence and armed guards around his little conclave. And even though he was 300 metres from his neighbours who reckon they heard all the screaming, that's what they heard. As an aside, I live a kilometre from my nearest neighbour, off there to the northeast. Out that direction to the east, a kilometre and a half, there's a highway. Now I just heard my neighbour's dog bark at a kilometre because the wind's coming from there, and the dog wasn't barking particularly loud, but I can hear him barking at his dogs when he's in full tilt yelling. I can hear him against an east wind bringing every gear change of the trucks on the highway. So he's louder than a truck at a kilometre and a half when he's 1 kilometre away shouting. I've lived in a village and I've heard other households having domestic disputes at a distance of a kilometre, and I'm sure they heard mine. So there's nothing unreliable in a witness statement saying at the middle of the night, 300 metres away, I heard my neighbours having a domestic dispute. I'm calling you because this time there's gunshots involved. That's quite reasonable. Now Oscar's story to the police is that he woke up in the middle of the night and he heard a noise. And because he heard a noise, he grabbed his gun and without pulling his stumps on, he hobbled down to his 7 metres to his toilet door and he fired 4 shots through the toilet door while yelling to his girlfriend to call the police because there was an intruder. No phone call was made. Then he went back to the bedroom, put his legs on, come back and he used a cricket bat to knock the door down and find his girlfriend shot, fatally dying in the toilet. Little narrow toilet, nowhere for her to go. He's shooting through the door, and if he had to use a cricket bat to knock the door down, then that proves that he did not shoot at the lock to try and get in. He shot at whoever was in there and he wanted to hit him, and he was firing with a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Bap, 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 bap. What a brave boy, crybaby Blade Runner. So that's his story, is that he's not guilty of murder because he thought he was only shooting at a burglar. And the cops said, well, there was no evidence of forced entry. You and your girlfriend were the only ones in the building. There's no possible way you thought you were shooting at a burglar. The cops also pieced the door back together and, stuck welding rods through the ballistic tracks in the near skin and the far skin of the door, so that they've got a ballistic track that says that Oscar Pistorius wasn't down there on his knees when he was firing his gun, not unless he holds his gun up above his head like this. People fire handguns out in front of him like that, and he was standing up there when he fired through the door. And his girlfriend's got a bullet hole in one hand or the other. She's got a bullet hole in her hip, and she's got a bullet hole in her head. So she's been on the other side of the door going like this while he's bap, bap, bap shooting at his alleged burglar. So the policeman, Mr. Botha, Helmut Botha or something like that, he charges Oscar with murder. And the rich white establishment goes into shock and horror, and the policeman who was considered, a real good detective, suddenly finds himself facing rejuvenated charges that had been swept under the carpet 2 years ago from when he got drunk and him and his mate fired on a minivan and killed 7 people. So he's now facing 7 counts of murder because he said publicly that Oscar Pistorius should be charged with murder. Very interesting what happens when a rich white man in South Afrika gets caught shooting his girlfriend. Why does he want to shoot his girlfriend anyway? Well, she went from being an anonymous model to being a rising star in a reality show, TV show. And ever since the Crybaby Pistorius episode at the Paralympics, Oscar hasn't been getting quite as much press as he used to get. So I think attention deprivation syndrome has caused him to get crankier and crankier with his girlfriend. But in any reasonable justice system, the idea that he should be getting off because he thought that he was shooting at a burglar, it kind of implies that it's all right for rich people with guns to shoot at poor people if the rich people are afraid that the poor people might be breaking into their house. And I think that's a bloody stupid idea, although it is absolutely central to the concept of this selfish defence right that a lot of people in America and a bunch of people in Australia seem to think they have. It's amusing that so many of them claim that they're Christians, because I'm pretty sure that Jesus, the Christ, said, turn the other cheek, judge not thy fellow human, and he said you've got to obey the Mosaic law, thou shalt not kill. And somewhere along there's also vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. So anybody who decides that they can judge and execute another human because that other human inspires fear and trembling and paranoid persecution fantasies in the person with the gun, I think they're out of step with all of the best God theories of the last 3,000 years. They're even out of step with the pre-Abrahamic proto-Jews, because back then it was eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and that means you have to wait for the person to hit you first before you can hit them back. A preemptive strike is just a total act of cowardice, and to shoot at a toilet door because you think there might be a burglar behind it, that's an act of fucking wishful thinking and bullshit to expect anybody to believe that that's what's going on. But that's what Crybaby Blade Runner is trying to make fly. And who knows, maybe the South African justice system is corrupt enough to let it go through. Interesting. Sitting here, as far as I can see, it's just more proof that if you have a gun for self-defence, it means that when you're pissed off and in temper tantrum mode, it's going to be that much easier for you to fuck the whole situation up permanently for everybody. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.